Tony this morning was talking about some of the real challenges in the northern parts of Ontario in terms of being able to provide access to services, and I don't know if you wanted to say any more about that
well,
today, Tony.
One of the things that I guess I was thinking about listening to some of the other presentations this afternoon, in particular Larry Smith's program, is that I think we really should be thinking a little bit more about what it is that our goals are in providing of programs. And as somebody, in this field, one of the worries that I have is that programs tend to be evaluated only in terms of their effects on reoffending, on recidivism. And that seems to me to be a very, very narrow and unfortunately narrow way of thinking about programs. And without knowing any of the data in Larry Smith's program, I'll use his as an example. Let's imagine that when the University of Western Australia does a really thorough evaluation of his program, that what they find is, as compared to comparable offenders who don't go through the program, that there's no real impact on reoffending, but that what happens is that people get jobs, people feel better about themselves, people hold those jobs for longer, and so on, but that their likelihood of reoffending is not changed. Now, it would seem to me that as a correctional, that his department should still be very proud of that program. And they should be proud of it because it's had a positive impact on people. And if you look at all sorts of other programs in society, I mean, I'm at a university, and nobody evaluates the University of Toronto on whether it affects offending. They evaluate the University of Toronto as to whether we put out we produce more educated students than they were when they came in. And it seems to me that in terms of prison programs or in terms of correctional programs, if all we're looking at is reoffending, we're missing an opportunity to think about positive things. I mean, I think that what we should be thinking about are much broader things. I mean, we have people, they're under our control for some period of time, and are they better people when they leave? And better is a very broad term, and I meant it as that. And one of them, as I said, is you think about that sort of thing. And in that sense, it kind of frees you from this very, very narrow effect. I mean, one of the concerns that I have is when you look only at offending, the difficulty for corrections is that you only have a very small part of of the puzzle of that person. You don't have much about the community that they're going back to. You can try to affect who that person associates with, but you don't have an enormous amount of control. So that if we looked broadly, maybe we would be a little bit more creative about what we're trying to accomplish.
How do you feel about that, Larry?
Yeah, look, I tend to agree. We, being in the prison system, we have a lot of emphasis on reoffending and recidivism rates and re-imprisonment rates. Most of the programs I operate, we look at the employment side of things. So research says that employment is one area of disadvantage that people have, and that does affect recidivism rates. So I don't sort of do programs to think, oh God, but these guys come back to prison. I do it on the focus of, okay, let's see what we can do from day one to when they leave, and the added benefit of that is not coming back to prison. In the remote part of Western Australia, there's a whole range of things, and I think I was speaking to you today about it, that my theory is, or what I believe in, and I've read a few things on this, is it's not about the race, it's about the place. If you just put all Aboriginals in the same basket, you're doing the same, you're not achieving much, because you have urban Aboriginals who have gone to university and they're holding down good jobs. bridging the gap for them is a lot less than remote Aboriginals who can't even speak English. There's a whole range of things that are happening there. So you look at the programs that we run, particularly in Western Australia, I'm only speaking from a Western Australian point of viewpoint, is that we have therapeutic programs that are all the same. 16 weeks of alcohol or violence. How does that happen in the metropolitan area compared to remote areas? It doesn't have the same impact because of language difficulties, etc. So re-imprisonment rates, to me, I don't focus on that. I focus on what my role is, and that's the employment side of things. And it's a bit broader than that. It's employment doesn't have to be the be-all and end-all, because up in the remote communities, if a prisoner leaves and he's been given all these skills that he's gone through a program with us, stays at home all day, but the wife thinks that's wonderful and we get what we get, and that's a happy life, that to me is a great result. They don't have to be working because that's probably not in their makeup to work in a normal environment that we feel. So,
but I guess the program that you've just presented on does one thing. It actually turns the paradigm a bit on its head and starts to look at people as social capital and not social liabilities. And that in itself is probably one of its best selling points, in that you can say to people, look, we're actually treating people as people who are of value and who are able to contribute back to the community. I guess the challenge that I imagine is how you then move to the more difficult to sell, the less saleable people, the people who don't have the driver's license, the people we were talking about before, the ones that are probably a bit harder to place. Yeah.
Well, it's a situation that I can't help everyone. There's prisoners we all know there's prisoners in the prison system that, probably will never see the light of day. They've got major issues that my programs are never ever going to address. So I've got a limited target group that I can work on. Now, if that target group, we look at the most disadvantaged and we look at them from orientation onwards, so we can set a path for them, and that doesn't have to be the same path. It's working on an individual basis. So the staff I have in the prisons will see these guys at orientation and develop a path for them, and that could be referral to something else, or it could be a referral to go, okay, let's have a look at some of the areas that you want to go on. Some of them have never worked before, so work experience may be a big factor. But the end result doesn't have to be employment at the end. The end result is, what's good for the person.
I guess it's trying to provide the access to whatever.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really talking about today.
And to be realistic, it's like smoking.
Access.
There's always going to be a relapse.
Yeah.
And people think that we can solve all the problems. They're put in prison and all of a sudden we can solve all the problems. So it's not the case. We get them for a short period in time, and there's some retrenched factors that are involved.
Peter, a penny for your thoughts on the subject?
I just recall when I was working up in the Riverland many years ago, we ran an alcohol and drug program specifically for Aboriginal offenders, and we used the terminology. The program was called Muthan and Yandi, and basically we brought the offenders in. They lived out on which was called Gerard Reserve, which was about 30 k's out of Berry at the time. And we'd go out, pick them up, bring them in, and then we'd have lunch under the tree at the back of the office. We started off with 10, and we had 16 that came through the program. They tagged on. Out of that, they got driver's licences, stopped using drugs and alcohol, to the point that some of them were saying, oh, well, we're now helping the missus with the dishes. Sex is better, and it just went on and on. All the little things in our life that we take for granted, they suddenly realised there was much more opening there. Getting their licence was a big thing, because that gave them the opportunity, living out in I won't say remote area, but a bit further out of town, they could go and get work. And it was a real eye-opener for me to see the way they took that on board. And so I guess the lesson for me out of that was perhaps we have to change some of our programs to fit into their culture, and that they could see what we were trying to promote and they could take it on board.
Of course, the remote area stuff that Graham's involved in is trying to do that by pooling resources in these sort of strange corners artificial corners that we've created by state and territory boundaries. Yeah. Anybody want to make a comment, ask a question, say something, do a dance, sing a song?
Well, I might say that in the 1980s, the WA prison program had a driver training program that went for quite some time. I don't know what
Yes, we still...
it and why it hasn't started again, but it's like the wheel goes round, doesn't it?
Yeah, we've had a driver program ever since I've been there. It assists everyone in gaining a licence.
So it is still going.
Yeah.
One of my other lives, I was in charge of the volunteer unit in South Australia, and we were very fortunate that one of our volunteers was actually a driving instructor. The biggest issue for us with Aboriginal people was some form of identification. You need identification to get your driver's licence. So we set up a scheme there where we could get identification. Then they could come to one of my offices at the time and with the volunteer go and achieve their learners, and then they could follow on and get their full licence afterwards. But that was a scheme that the licence seems to be a real thing that holds people back because they can't go anywhere. Actually, there's some really good ads on South Australia at the moment about losing your licence, and it's so restrictive if you don't have one.
Yeah, and if you're disqualified for a squillion years, then you're in big trouble. Also, reflecting on Gail's talk this morning and the reference to seagulls, I guess that's a big issue in terms of providing equity of access. I guess people flying into towns or driving into towns and really not being empowered to do much, just sort of spending their lives going around in circles and I mean, I don't know whether the stuff that Donna was talking about yesterday about the project they're hoping to get funded in Burke in the community, and that's trying to actually empower communities to do for themselves, to look after themselves and to look after their own needs. The old teach people how to fish rather than give them a feed of fish. I don't know how we do that. I don't consider myself an expert, never having worked in remote areas. Yes. Sorry, I'm as deaf as a post. Well, not quite, but nearly.
Hi. I was just thinking, and I was listening yesterday with Burke, and I sort of felt that is a town that's always been had a lot of problems and lack of resources. So I sort of don't understand why government is not sort of going in there and doing something about it, like government help. I guess I may be naive. Please do, yeah.
My name's Narelle Jeffrey and I'm formerly been the area manager which encompasses the Burke catchment area back in New South Wales. So I thought I'm probably best positioned here maybe to chat, except for my colleague here, Betty Stefanovic, who's actually the manager of Burke Community Corrections. So Betty's only just taken up the gauntlet though, so I think I'll respond. So Burke's been identified, I guess, in New South Wales as being part of the Rivertown community. So government for a long time have looked at different programs in those for Rivertown. So there's Burke, Brewarrina, Walgett and Wentworth Denton. Some of us call them the B&W towns because that's where they are. So in each of those communities, certainly under COAG trials, with Murdy Parky area, there was huge connect with community, and virtually government all agencies were then required to go back to community working parties before we were looking at implementing anything new in those communities. So there has been, I guess, work done on the ground in Bourke. I think Bourke, not unlike Dubbo, gets a little bit of a bad rap sometimes in the media. So all you hear about is the adverse things that occur in the town. So in Bourke we heard that, you know, the medical centre got burnt down, and then there was a huge government response to that. And what you don't hear about, though, is the way that the community have pulled together in terms of really creating a great sense of community. They have Red Ochre festivals, they have Dream festivals, and certainly, you know, they're working far closer together now in the Bourke community, both in government and with community leaders out there, than what they've ever done. So, yeah, it's a little bit. When I heard that yesterday, I thought Bourke's really come a long way, and I don't think we celebrate some of their successes. You know, it's a difficult community because there's been long-standing, you know, social issues out there in that particular area. So, yeah, it's certainly getting there, and it's certainly not. I really like Bourke, actually. It's a great little gig. You know, it's not a community where you don't feel safe. Yet, I think most people in New South Wales would probably say, "Oh, Bourke's one of those communities where you've got to, you know, watch yourself, and you wouldn't walk around at night, and you wouldn't do this, and the shutters come down." Well, yes, there is some of that, but you know, the community certainly also celebrate its successes, and they're really, really receptive. They know when you're coming into town. They're quite embracing, you know, even in terms of reporting to us at probation and parole. You know, they're really quite receptive to that. You know, because I think for a lot of times we're the first people that have really, particularly in Bourke, you know, you become the pseudo drug and alcohol worker, you become the pseudo mental health worker, because some of those service provision is on a fly-in basis. So, you know, certainly last year, the psychologists were coming in from the Lismore area. So Lismore's way, way up near the Queensland border, and they were flying then into Bourke to service the Bourke community. And those other Rivertown communities. So, yeah, I think we'll see improvement. There's what we call LIPs out there, which are local implementation plans that have been developed with government and community sitting down at the one table, and certainly Sam Jeffries from the regional, you know, assembly under that COAG initiative has been, you know, leading that charge for some time, and Premier and Cabinet take those Rivertown communities very serious. Yeah.
So there's not one particular magic bullet that's kind of made this start to come together. It's been a...
Well, I would say probably in the last 10 years that I've been out in that, you know, western area. My area used to take on, I don't know if you know the geographics of New South Wales, but I would take on from Wellington out to Bourke, Canamble, Broken Hill, and then into the Forbes, Lake Cargellico area. So it's quite a huge area. So I couldn't say that there's one thing, but certainly in New South Wales we had a very robust regional management team. So, and that was a team that was an initiative of Premier and Cabinet, and basically it had decision makers from all government agencies at the one table, and it was to look at strategic way of government doing business together and in communities, and how we would engage both the Indigenous communities as well as local councils, as well as progress associations out in some of those more remote locations, and government agencies. So I wouldn't say it's one thing, but it's been, you know, quite a long time with, I guess, good determination and goodwill from a lot of people that are quite passionate about that area of New South Wales, saying we have to do things differently, because what we know in our communities is that communities are migrating into larger regional centres. So, you know, for Bourke, for example, when I first started in 1992, and Brian was my training officer, we wouldn't actually, you know, really supervise people from the Bourke area. They stayed in Bourke, Dubbo people stayed in Dubbo, and now what we find is that there's quite a migration coming into those regional centres, because service provision out there has disappeared. Employment options and availability is much better in larger regional centres, and you know, kids want Maccas. So you can't get Macca's at Burke, and or the shopping's not as prevalent. So these days a lot of people want to come into those regional areas for that. So I think that's one of the downfalls in some of our little smaller remote communities in New South Wales, is that some of the things that make them unique and make them really special aren't as protected perhaps as what they were 10 years or so ago.
Thanks, Narelle. Does anybody else want to comment? Marion.
I'd like to ask a question of Professor Doob, if I may. I understand that you spoke this morning on the stability of offender rates in Canada, and just wondered if that was linked to equity and service provision or to other factors. Can you explain that to us, please?
Yeah, the imprisonment rate in Canada has been stable, as I described it. Offending rates have changed over time, and I guess one of the interesting things that the contrast between Canada and the United States shows is that, or at least it illustrates, I think better than shows, is that imprisonment rates and offending rates are pretty independent of each other. I mean, we've had our offending rates, whatever measure you wanted to look at in terms of crimes reported to the police, for the last 50 years or so, have been quite parallel to what's gone on in the United States. On violence rates much lower, but they sort of went up at the same period of time and started down in the early 1990s at pretty much the same time. Our imprisonment rates have been constant, and the American imprisonment rate, as everybody knows, was fairly constant for about 40 years, which ended at about the mid-1970s, and then went up by a factor of about 500%. And so I think what it sort of illustrates to me is that it's a policy decision on the part of the criminal justice system, maybe an explicit policy or maybe an implicit policy as to who you want to incarcerate. The evidence, as I mentioned at some point earlier, the evidence on the impact of incarceration would suggest that governments should be investing much more in communities than in imprisonment, because it's just an expensive way of making people worse. And perhaps that, what we need to understand is that or what many countries need to understand is that they're not going to imprison themselves away from crime. That if what you do is you invest in much more important kinds of things having to do with the communities. But as I said, the interesting thing is our crime rates have sort of moved in parallel in quite mysterious ways. And yet we've never, until 2006 with our new government, really believed that imprisonment was a good solution. So it's an interesting puzzle, but I think that the reason we've had a stable imprisonment policy is that the government just hasn't, until 2006, liked prisons. And so prisons are seen as necessary, but not as a really good thing.
I suspect that the views of various state governments in Australia have... sorry? You can't hear me? Oh. I was going to say I suspect that the views of various governments in Australia have been a lot more attuned to the sorts of pressures generated through the press and those sorts of things. They seem to lurch backwards and forwards over time. Anybody else want to make any comments about what's been said so far, or open up another line of discussion? Yes.
Can you hear me? One of the major problems we have in the Northern Territory is the Can you hear me now? Okay. One of the major problems we have in the Territory is a really low numeracy and literacy rate, especially with Indigenous children. You know, a lot of them rarely go to school, and so any time they're trying to get employment, it's just not possible, not really. Do you have the same type of problem in your own areas? And is there any programs that you do that could make it better?
Is that to you?
Is that to me? Who is this to? Any of us? I really don't know very much about this. I mean, it's certainly these are problems, but my guess is that part of the difficulty is that programs. Let me just give this as actually an example. There's concern in some of the correctional systems in Canada that maybe the literacy or basic education programs aren't maybe that important because they haven't been able to link them very easily to recidivism. So people who get the programs don't necessarily reoffend at a lower rate. And of course, what that what that is doing is saying, one part of the puzzle isn't linked to some broad outcome, as opposed to saying that one part of the puzzle, as in Larry's thing, is only one part of the puzzle, and it's part of a much bigger set of things that you have to do, you have to put in place. So if you don't take a holistic approach to it, then you can't justify it. I think that part of the difficulty that we've had, for example, in Aboriginal communities with schooling is that when there is a question as to what it is that the schooling program, that a literacy program or a basic schooling program is going to do for a youth in a remote community. I mean, why is that going to be relevant when they look around and they see a community that has very serious problems? In my very limited experience, when kids would ask me that question, I felt a little embarrassed that I didn't have a good answer as to why it was useful. I can give all the general things about how literacy and numeracy are important in modern society, and then you look around to the community and you say, well, that's really good, but then what? And I think that the difficulty is that if you don't link it to positive outcomes, to sort of more immediate, visible positive outcomes, what are you going to do? I mean, how do you justify it? When my son was growing up, it was very easy to explain to him, living in downtown Toronto, why these kinds of skills were important. He could look all around him and see that, and everybody around him was in effect using these kinds of skills. You live in a community where that isn't the case, you've got a very different kind of challenge. And I suppose that, taking it out of the community and back into a correctional setting, one of the things that I was impressed with your program is that you are looking at it in a sense in the broad way that we look at in terms of what does it mean to be a citizen in modern society. And where we take these things apart, it doesn't work very well.
Literacy and numeracy is a major problem in WA. We have about a 42% Aboriginal population in the prison system, which in itself is disgusting to say the least. But the literacy and numeracy rates are very low. They're in their C's and D's. We categorise A, B, C's and D's. Taking up your point, it depends what they're using it for. Education in our prison system is not compulsory, but a lot do attend. More for the skills and the vets training than the literacy and the ABE type situations. We have more literacy in the vet side of things. So we have a program called HOLP, Hands-On Learning Program, or Hands-On Literacy Program, where literacy and numeracy is involved in all the vet training we do. So we embed that into all the training we do. That would be enough for industry and for employment. But again, going back to communities, the other stuff getting up to an A or a B is not relevant. And to get people sitting in a room trying to do literacy and numeracy while they're in prison, it's a tough ask, particularly in a classroom situation. So you've got to develop ways of doing it without them knowing.
I think also you've got to look at, especially in remote communities, is what are they going to get out of that? What is at the end of the line for them when they go to school? And I remember being over in Brood Island a few years ago, and it was so rewarding. I was at the airport, and there was a group of children in lovely bright green shirts and white sand shoes. So I'm sitting there and they came up to me and they said, "Hello, ma'am." I had corrections written all over me. And I said, "Hello, what are you doing here today?" And they said, "We're going to Melbourne, we're going to a football match. That's our reward." And I said, "What for?" And they said, "Because I went to school every day and I was respectful to my teacher." And I said, "And how does that make you feel?" "Makes me proud to be an Aboriginal kid. Makes me proud to tell you, ma'am, what I've been doing." So I think it was a reward at the end of the day for their education, and they wanted to go on further because each year or each day that they went to school, there was a reward, so they could see something. Their parents could see, sending them to school, there was something at the end of the line for them. So it made them proud too. So I think, not sure who it was, it might have been Johnny, it said, not one size fits all. So we've got to take that into consideration. So not something that happens in one community is going to happen into another community. Sorry, Ken.
I think work is really critical because it gives us so much. But I'm also really mindful that in the last 30 years, we have gone from a workforce internationally from 1.5 billion to 4.5 billion. And a lot of those in really low-wage economies. And so, Australia is no different than New Zealand, no different than the US. That we're losing a lot of the jobs that I think actually lots of the kind of the jobs that are meaningful, the production jobs. We're losing a lot of that kind of part of society, and there's a real risk, I think, that we become like a consumption society, like the US has, and I think that's problematic. And I'd be interested in your ideas around, because I think that's a tidal wave, personally. I think about Johnny in Vanuatu, 248,000 youth. If you ask how many of those youth are unemployed, huge number. And so I think we've got a time bomb for young people, and I think when young people don't have meaningful activity in life, they get into mischief. We know that, because we're often picking up those pieces. So I'd like your comments about some of that more international kind of trend.
It's a pretty tough call, isn't it? One of the things I say when we put our guys through training, that the work's got to be sustainable and ongoing. And it's a catch-22 situation, or it's a tough which way do you fly? Because if you get guys who have been out in society and they've been doing the wrong sort of thing and they've been earning big bucks, and then you try and sell them a factory job that's only going to earn basic wages, and they're going to be supporting 3 and 4 kids, and they're not going to last long in that particular thing. I'm speaking generally here, I'm not, talking specifically. So you've got to look at the individual as it were. Some people, yes, like that sort of work and they'll continue to do that. But I also encourage people to raise the bar as well. Just because they've been in prison doesn't mean they need to get all those low-lying jobs. And that's particularly evident with the females. When you go into hospitality type area, they go, "Oh yeah, I'll be a waitress." We'll say, "Hang on a minute, why don't you be an apprentice chef?" And no one's going to take me on in that situation. So it's a tough call. You've got to look at saying, okay, there's a lot of those jobs available, but if you're going to try and get people to have a meaningful future, you've got to look at how ambitious they are and what type of situation they're going to be when they get out. Because if they're going to be in a situation where they're with all their mates who are selling stuff for X amount of dollars and they start an apprenticeship at below minimum wage, it's a no-brainer.
Any other comments from the panel on that? I think we're almost to the point where we need to wind up.